Okay.
Hello, everyone. We're going to get started today. Thank you all for coming to the archives. If you haven't been here before, welcome. And today we have Jeff Guay with us, and he will be presenting on the APA riots that happened in Butte in 1894. The APA, or the American Protective Association, was a nationwide anti-Catholic group that achieved political and social prominence in Butte in the mid-1890s. With a large Irish Catholic population in the city, APA activities fueled a full-scale riot in the streets of Butte on July 4th, 1894. As the 2024 Carrie Johnson Fellow, Jeff Guay spent countless hours in the Butte-Silver Bow Public Archives researching the APA riots of 1894. His findings reveal not only the animosities between Irish and Protestant groups in the mining camp, but also the complicated ways that the city's Black and Chinese populations were involved in this explosive rivalry. Again, thank you, Jeff. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks so much for coming out. I really appreciate the turnout. And so what I'm going to do is kind of read parts of this essay that I've written as part of the results of my research, but it's a long essay. I'm not going to do everything. I've got a few slides to show you, and I'm kind of also just kind of talk, and then I can also make some time for questions at the end. And I just want to introduce myself a little bit. I am not from Butte. My grandfather was from Butte. He was a graduate of Butte Central in 1938, and he went to school at the School of Mines before leaving Montana in his career as like a mining engineer. But I've always been sort of drawn to the history. I'm particularly drawn to the labor history of Butte. And I really like stories in history that go against the grain of what I expect, so things that surprise me. And a lot of times there's certain parts of this story when I kind of tell people what it's about, they go, oh really? Why that? You know? So I like to find things that are sort of contrarian in the way that I understand certain stories in history. So I'll start by kind of just explaining a little bit about the background of the American Protective Association, which is what APA stands for. Some of the sources that I looked at here in the archives, the Examiner is Butte's APA newspaper, and it's really vitriolic and nasty. And I kind of compare it to like a modern day like internet troll is what they were doing. I accessed Charles Hawesworth papers. He was a mayor in the 30s, but his father was one of the people that I confirmed to be a member of the APA and played a very central role in the riot that occurred. There are no meeting minutes for the American Protective Association. They were a secret society, but there's a lot of overlap with the Oddfellows. And then obviously they were hated by the Irish secret societies, such as the Robert Emmet Literary Association. So they're mentioned in those minute books. Lots of information in the directories and in books such as The Battle for Butte by Michael Malone. A lot of stuff comes from David Emmons, which I'll mention. There's a book here in our library called The Wages of Whiteness by David Rodiger, which is really interesting. Mining Irish American Lives. And then there's a essay in the Vertical Files by Laura Lee Davenport that's about where she did a lot of research into African American citizens around this time in Butte. So those are all really interesting resources. This is the only photograph of the riot, but it kind of shows the mayhem, which I think is the correct word for what occurred on July 4th, 1894.
Could you identify that street for us?
Yeah, it's Broadway, right?
Broadway, looking west.
Looking east.
Looking east, okay.
What is
The
that?
city halls in the background.
Yeah, look at those guys are already.
Yeah.
Where the second guy is on the telephone pole, you can see the old city hall. If that, oh yeah, right.
Yeah, I think like balconies were a pretty important architectural feature. People could hang out on balconies and shout at each other and stuff like that. Very, very convenient in a riot to be up in the balcony, I think. Yeah, you have your streetcar lines going through. People could really get around not only the city but around the state on rails, which was also an interesting part of the area. I'm going to start with some background to the American Protective Association. It had a very brief political period, but they were all over America. They were especially seemed to take root in mining cities, and they have at their, I think in the root, it's very interesting how at the very beginning of their inception in Iowa, there was something that I think echoes the conditions in Butte. So basically you had an elite ownership class in this small Iowa area, and they had become allied with the Knights of Labor, and the Knights of Labor were predominantly Irish. And in this essay that I found by Joanne Manfra, unable to neutralize the economic elite itself, the APA struck out instead at the elite's Irish allies. They appealed to latent anti-Catholic sentiment as a political continuation of their fight against entrepreneurial hegemony in Clinton. So you can kind of see how in Butte, we're going to talk a lot about, although it's a history that I'm sure a lot of you for those of us that are a little more familiar with Butte history, you'll know that the Copper Kings War is very much entrenched at this moment. But at least, so a very significant chunk of this sort of ownership class of this area is Marcus Daly and the Anaconda Company, which is very much an Irish Catholic, has that Irish Catholic background and hiring preference. Nationwide, you'll see this in the Examiner, but also in any sort of APA propaganda. They didn't really have a lot of political goals outside of removing Catholics from public office. They were extremely against Catholic schools and hospitals. So they were very much arguing in favor of public schools and for teacher licensure. That's one of the very specific things, which as a former teacher, I think of those things as, pillars of society, but I'm not so sure with the APA how much they really cared about, funding schools so much as defunding Catholic schools. And it's important to understand the labor side of this story, which is that we have a growing divide between the Cornish and the Irish miners, mostly Cornish, but there's other sort of Protestant immigrant groups. But the Cornish and the Irish rivalry, in some historians' assessment, is something that even goes on to play a big role in the dynamiting of the Union Hall, which is just the rubble of which is just behind us. So. And this is the summer before the final vote on the capital fight. So it's Anaconda for Marcus Daly and Helena from William Clark. And Anaconda is, on one hand, thought of as this sort of corporate company town, but it's also thought of as an Irish Catholic stronghold. And Butte is really sort of wrapped up in, I think you'll kind of see in this story that Butte gets a little bit torn at the seams because of this question. But where you stand on the capital fight is where, for a lot of people, is where you stand in this sort of rivalry that we're talking about. And Helena is thought of as a Protestant town. It's oftentimes in the Butte newspapers, especially the sort of ones with the Irish Catholic sentiments. It's directly accused of being an APA city. And so the APA rivalry and the APA activities are really seen in this. And I'll bring this up later, but when the Robert Emmet Literary Society of Butte in the minutes books that we have here, they talk about this is a decade later, where they talk about the statue of Thomas Francis Meagher that they're going to erect on the grounds. And they say, we want to do this so that the APA has to look at his face every time they go to the Capitol. We have a situation where we have, Irish Catholics in the ownership class with both Marcus Daly and Daniel Hennessy. We also have the Butte Miners Union becoming increasingly dominated, at least in the leadership, from first and second generation Irish. And in 1894, Butte elects its first Irish mayor, which was particularly offensive to the APA. Okay, so for a second, I'm going to read the intro to my essay, and then I'm going to read to you the actual event as I transcribed it from the newspaper accounts of the riot itself. On July 4th, 1894, the streets of Butte, Montana became a religious war zone. A conflict began in the early morning with an explosion of dynamite, reaching its zenith nearly 24 hours later. In the end, the city would be reeling from the deaths of several people, multiple shootings, dozens of arrests, and untold injuries. The city's police would be blotted with black eyes and bruises, and one of their number would be fatally shot. Only the state militia, marching shoulder to shoulder with fixed bayonets, would be able to bring the chaos to a conclusion. The riot was caused by 3 letters, APA, that appear at first glance to divide the mining city in two. Closer examination, however, reveals a confusion of fault lines that run through 1890s Butte and throughout Montana along lines of race, class, ethnicity, and religion. So we'll get to some of these thornier questions after we just read about, the riot itself. So on the afternoon of July 3rd, 1894, Butte Tavern owner Simon Hawsworth decorated the front windows of his establishment, the Columbia Saloon, with patriotic bunting that formed the letters APA. Hawsworth was a Swiss immigrant, Civil War combat veteran, and one of Butte's first white citizens. He came to Butte in 1864 with his brother as part of the gold rush. And shortly thereafter, they opened the town's first hotel, the Hotel de Mineral. I'm going to actually show you that. My slides are not always. These are from the Hawsworth collection. So this is, especially when you take that photo of the riot and compare it to this, like 30 years difference, it's quite stunning. The mayor, his son, who became the mayor in the 30s, was born in one of these log cabins. And this is the Hotel de Mineral. His son Charles, born in a log cabin when Butte was very much a frontier town, would become mayor during the Great Depression. Simon Hawsworth was one of the city's most prominent members of the American Protective Association, but the nationally organized Patriotic Order maintains strict secrecy, so his motivations for joining are unknown. Still, the Catholic stronghold of Butte, placing APA letters in his windows was a daring move. He was not alone. Down the street, John J. Anderson, also a prominent APA leader and owner of the Sazerac Saloon, had decorated his windows with the same letters. On the 3rd of July, when Hawsworth first decorated his bar's windows, the reaction was swift. Throughout the day, as Butte's many labor unions and fraternal organizations were planning for their role in the holiday parade, a host of Butte's Irish men and women began visiting the Columbia and Sazerac saloons, vocally demanding the letters be taken down. Both Hawsworth and Anderson refused. At 2:35 a.m., the morning of the 4th, an unidentified man crawled near a window on the side of the Columbia Saloon and lit a stick of dynamite, probably procured from his work site. The blast shattered the half-inch plate glass window, blew a hole in the sidewalk, and concussed 2 men nearby. The APA letters on the front-facing window remained intact. The patrons, the bartenders, and Hawsworth himself stayed inside unperturbed. Drinking resumed, and the letters stayed. Morning arrived and the city's parade went along as scheduled. Thousands of people attended as an enormous pageant of Butte's bands, unions, fraternal orders, and secret societies celebrated their patriotism. As many as 200 Indians paraded, most likely from among the Cree people living in a segregated camp on the south of town. Many of them were on horseback and in full regalia, a proud display of their indigenous culture, while under supervision of a man named Solomon Levy, who was known as a patron of the Aboriginals. I think he would be an interesting research topic if anybody knows about him. He apparently spoke many different indigenous languages. But yeah, he seemed like a really interesting person. Organized labor was well represented. Unions for tailors, blacksmiths, shoers, plumbers, cooks, and waiters all marched. The typesetters union made a visually pleasing spectacle carrying red and white and blue umbrellas and wearing high hats and long dusters. The APA was not officially represented, but the city's Catholic and Protestant divide was nonetheless illustrated. A Catholic fraternal order called the Young Men's Institute marched. A group that the Butte Examiner, which was the APA newspaper, will later claim had been created in California in direct response to APA activities. They were followed not long after by the Patriotic Order Sons of America, a group with membership and ideological overlap with the APA. These men carried with them a miniature building, painted red with a sign that said, "Our Public Schools." This red schoolhouse would be evoked the following year in the pages of the APA Examiner with a poem about the evils of Catholic private schools. That little red schoolhouse no priest ever entered. A fierce, angry mob rises up to destroy our bulwark of freedom, but 'tis our intention to defend it for the American boy. By noon on the 4th, with the parade over, thousands of us attendees were still in city limits, and a large assembly of angry men and women, mostly Irish, Catholic, or both, returned to the Columbia Saloon to protest the APA letters still in the window. Most of Hosworth's customers stayed at the bar to continue their holiday drinking. An unknown number of them, however, went outside to meet the mob on the street where numerous fights broke out. One newspaper claimed there were over 1,000 rioters. It is difficult to know which side had the numerical strength, but the chaos described in newspapers the following day suggests they were in an evenly matched free-for-all, where clubs, rocks, fists, revolvers, and knives were used continually. William Ferguson, an ex-police officer, pointed a revolver point-blank in the face of William Page, a well-known mine driller and also a Catholic. Ferguson pulled the trigger, but miraculously the bullet only grazed his forehead, passing through and hitting another man in the leg. Page was sent to the hospital and Ferguson to jail, but the incident exploded the already violent scene into one of full mayhem. Many of the Irish Catholic crowd followed the officers as they escorted Ferguson to jail, demanding his life. Mayor Dugan, that's the Butte's first Irish mayor, he was called to quell the riot. He met with Hosworth, entreating him to take down the letters, and Hosworth finally complied. Already at least 15 fights had occurred. At about 2:30 p.m., a heavy rain fell. It looked as though the riot might finally have abated. But a large crowd of Irish Catholics moved over only half a block to John Anderson's bar, the Sazerac. His windows still have the APA letters. Anderson, inside with as many as 30 sympathetic drinkers, still refused to take them down. Catholic rioters began throwing rocks into the bar and at the windows, smashing glass light fixtures. More fights in the street ensued. Butte's women got involved now. One reportedly beat people with her heavy cane. Others were seen arguing and slapping each other across the faces. Police, armed only with billy clubs, were almost powerless to stop the violence. If an officer began to apprehend one belligerent, either Protestant or a Catholic, a mob would swarm around the restrained fighter and begin to clobber them. At 4:30, the crowd was now said to be over 2,000 people. Mayor Dugan addressed them from the upper story of a nearby building, begging the violence to cease. The crowd only hurled abuse at him, so he announced that he had no choice but to call on the state militia. At 6:30, the rain stopped. A group of 5 police officers found themselves surrounded by the angry mob as they tried to halt the violence. Frank Morford, proprietor of the American Bakery and a Protestant member of the Patriotic Order Sons of America, and an enlisted member of the state militia, would later claim he had only entered the fray so he could gather other militia members who had been called to the nearby armory. As he became entangled with Officer Daly, that's Officer Dennis Daly, Morford pulled a pistol and shot the policeman in the heart. Daly fell and died almost instantly. The crowd began to break away, but 6 more shots were fired. Whether or not it was Morford who fired would later be hotly contested, but Samuel Dunn, a miner, was killed and several others were injured. Soon a nearby fire alarm had sounded. The basement of the combination gambling house was in flames a few blocks away. Whether the blaze was directed to the riot is uncertain. Firemen mobilized and put out that fire, and afterward, Mayor Dugan called them to the scene of the riots. This is when it gets even more interesting. Dugan would later claim that he had only ordered his firemen to turn water hoses on the Sazerac bar because he was the only one that still had the letters up. But they decided to stop by the Columbia Saloon anyways and flood that one out. Which kind of tells you which side of the argument they might have been on. So they turned their high-pressure fire hoses on them, and then Hosworth is apparently shooting his pistol back out of the bar towards the firemen. No one was hurt in that scene except for the bar. Then they go to the Sazerac Saloon. John Anderson, still unwilling to take the APA letters down. Fire hoses were put on full blast now, destroying the interior of the bar, soaking many of the men gathered within. Gunfire erupted from inside the tavern toward the firemen, though none were hit. Another rioter fired his revolver back at the men in the bar. No one was wounded, but the tavern was completely wrecked. After hours of miscommunicated telegrams to Helena, Governor Rickards finally placed Butte under martial law. At 7:15 p.m., 17 hours after a dynamite blast marked the beginning of the violence, the state militia was fully mobilized and on the scene. With fixed bayonets, the militia left the armory and marched to Broadway. At gunpoint, and not without difficulty, the militia finally dispersed the crowd and held the street until 9 a.m. the following morning, July the 5th. So that is the story of the riot. And obviously, I love a good story of a riot. I don't really want to be a part of one. But the thing that got me interested in this story actually was a very brief part of David Emmons' book, The Butte Irish, where he mentions that there was an APA colored council, a group of Butte African-American men that formed their own council of the American Protective Association. And that was very surprising to me, and I didn't know, I wanted to know more. And that was really probably the main reason why I wanted to investigate this story, because the riot itself has been written about. There's a lot more details in the newspaper accounts than that I was able to sort of find that I hadn't seen in some of the other books that I'd read. But I was really interested in this APA colored council, especially when in the pages of the Examiner I read this: "The Anglo-Saxon race rules the world. The American, though a composite people, are a high type of the modern Anglo-Saxon. APA success will attend the supremacy of the Anglo-Saxon." I can't think of a more clearly stated bit of white supremacy, right? So why would any of Butte's black citizens join? It was an interesting question, and the first thing that sort of came up in my research was the newspaper, The Colored Citizen, which was in Helena, and its editor, J.P. Ball. I have no reason to believe that he was a member of the APA, but some of his arguments against Anaconda for the Capitol echo certain things that were being said by the APA. So the Colored Citizen is a really interesting paper. I believe it's Montana's first black newspaper, but it was bankrolled by William Clark. And it was bankrolled for the sole purpose of advocating for Helena as the capital. And as soon as Helena won that election, this newspaper ceased to exist. So you can see how convoluted the rhetorical waters are during this time in terms of the accusations that are leveled. I mean, it's like trying to go on Twitter and decide what you think based off of the insults that are being hurled, basically. But the Colored Citizen makes this claim: the Anaconda Mining Company does not employ a solitary colored man. Dagos and foreigners prefer to native colored men. So I did as much research as I could do, especially considering that the archives in Helena are currently closed. A lot of secondary sources, meaning the historians that have written about Butte history, seem to mention or seem to agree with this statement, but a lot of them are citing this actual piece as their information about it. It does not appear to be very far from the truth, is what I would say. I went through several of the city directories for Butte during this period, and they're relevant because they'll say whether a person is black, and they'll say what their occupation was. It's not a thorough demographic representation, but one of the things that I found from looking at that, which I thought was really interesting, so the Butte City Directory of 1893 identifies 52 male residents as colored and gives their profession. Of these men, only one is listed as working in mining. Several others are barbers or cooks. One man is listed as being in jail. 31, this is interesting, so out of 52, 31 of them, more than half, are in the service industry, meaning that they are waiters or porters. 9 of these work at the McDermott Hotel, which is now the Finland Hotel, which was a very sort of posh one-percenter type of place. The directory is far from a thorough demographic account of Butte, as many residents lived in large boarding houses and would have been left off its pages. But unlike the census, the directory was updated and published every year, and a study of its pages suggests the same ethnic and racial trends in mining industry labor that most modern historians seem to agree on. And I thought this part was interesting too. So looking at the city directory, I wanted to kind of look at some Irish names. So I looked and found 216 surnames that begin with O apostrophe. So that's 216, right? Not one single man with a name that starts with an O works in the service industry in that year. Most of them are miners. Of the 46 male residents with the last name Shea, 36 are miners and none are waiters. Getting my pages confused here. There are 148 Sullivans listed. 105 of them are miners, including all 9 of the men named Cornelius Sullivan. All 25 John Sullivans are miners. The racial hiring preferences for Butte's mining industry therefore comes into clear focus. The 1900 census on file at the Butte-Silver Bow Archives, at least 167 black or colored residents can be counted. Their professions are various: musicians, blacksmiths, plasterers, stonecutters, bricklayers, janitors, boot blacks, hod carriers, millwrights, and wood choppers. At the epicenter of perhaps the mightiest copper-producing region in the world, there is only one black person listed as a mine operator. And what I found looking through the pages of the Examiner is a organization that does not offer anything to minority groups at all, but they have ample ammunition when they point to the Anaconda Company or the Butte Miners Union. So that's why I call them trolls. They even go as far as to say, and this, if you think about the time, there's one article where they say that the heathen Chinese is a better man than the Mick. But that was the same year that the Butte Miners Union boycotted all Chinese businesses in Butte. So again, they're not offering anything to the Chinese or to the blacks really. Except for that, the one thing I will say about the black citizens of Butte is that they were seemed to be mostly Republicans, and there were a couple people who, such the one APA member that I'll show you in a second, he was at least nominated, I think, for something in the Republican Party locally. And the APA did dominate the Republican Party in Butte for a couple of years. So, yeah, so I thought that was really interesting. And this is something that the APA said after. So the big win for the APA politically in Butte was the next mayoral election of William Thompson. He donated to Thompson Park. He seems to have been an APA member. I kind of think that a lot of those memberships might have been somewhat out of convenience. He did not seem to be a extreme politician by any means. But after that election, the Examiner said this: colored friends in the city are to be complimented as one man they go to the polls of an election to cast a ballot, bearing as its insignia the emblem of freedom. They need no priest or pope, that's a typo, or pope to instruct them. The only confirmed member of the black APA that I could find is a man named Nesbert Cothran. He had been in the 25th Infantry in Missoula. He was born in the 1860s in Alabama, and I presume he was either born enslaved or shortly after emancipation. He's listed as the secretary of the Colored Council. He was delegate to Silver Bow Republican Convention, 5th Ward in 1896. The only real thing I ever saw from him in particular that might have shed light on his sort of political views was later in the decade when, we're seeing a little more foreign policy stuff come up. There's the Council Number 19 publishes something about the border dispute in Venezuela. I'm a little unclear on it, but it's sort of, he was a veteran, and he saw, I think probably, my guess is that he saw a path for employment and betterment and really increasing opportunity for his people in the Army. There's a man named King Johnson who I believe was likely a member of the Colored Council. He and Nesbert Cothran lived in Butte during the same years, and in Missoula in 1900, together they opened up a black Republican club called the Riverside. And there's a few articles in the Missoulian about it because they were serving liquor without a license, and King Johnson got arrested. But there were lots of these sort of clubs back in the day of different sorts of groups where men could come and drink whiskey and smoke cigars. But he was also a veteran. He was an injured Civil War veteran. So a couple of interesting things. I want to show real quick some overlapping different groups, because again, there's not really much of a written record about the APA in Butte. But I recently, with my wife, we went to Ireland, and we went to a museum in Letterkenny. And there was a group called the Loyal Orange Order. And if you can imagine that they're not very popular in Ireland. So the LOL, they were founded in 1795, and they were loyal to King William of Orange. And what I found in the Butte archives is the Lincoln Loyal Orangemen. One of their members was a man named Abraham Yoder, who kind of shows up a lot during this time. I think he was in a lot of the fraternal groups as a sort of leadership position. I am not 100%, I say that he is a confirmed APA leader. I kind of forget exactly where things stand, but he was, the POSA, the Patriotic Order Sons of America, they seem to have a lot of overlap. And the LOL, if you can just think about how angry that might have made a patriotic Irishman to come to America and bump heads with them. You can see the signature of this man, J.F. Davies, who I believe worked in public schools in Butte. The Odd Fellows, this particular lodge number 12, these two aldermen, Schatzline and Heilig, were supported in their elections by the APA, and I don't believe the APA gave support to anybody unless they were confirmed members. Simon Hosworth of the Saloon. J.D. Caldwell, he was the editor of the APA Examiner, so I imagine that's probably mostly his eloquent writing that I've shown you today. John F. Davies, confirmed. William Boyce Thompson, the mayor, he was endorsed. One thing that I'll note is that in all of these people's obituaries, they list all kinds of fraternal orders, and none of them, even Caldwell, who was the editor of the Examiner, none of them mentioned the APA in their obituaries. So that brings me back to the questions I had about the colored council of the APA. If you can imagine, we don't know how many people were in it, but just imagine how dangerous it would have been to have made that affiliation known. So it really was a secret society, and if you can just imagine how much hatred there would have been in Butte against these people. I mean, the riot is the only evidence we really need. This is the quote from the RELA minutes, the Robert Emmett Literary Association. They're meeting to talk about, because they're kind of spearheading this statue, and the loss of the Capitol is you know, this is a big deal to a lot of the Irish Catholics in Silver Bow County. The magnificent monument, which is to be erected in his memory on the Capitol grounds of the state of Montana, where the APA must look in his face and salute his glorious memory. And that's 1903, and the APA is really not around anymore, but it really pissed them off. So, yeah, with that, I would just say I would like to open up to any questions that anybody has.
Could you just go back to the picture of the riot?
Absolutely.
Yeah.